The War on Poverty After 40 Years, a Minskyan Assessment by Stephanie Bell and L. Randall Wray. Barriers to Attaining and Sustaining Tight, Full Employment. Minsky seemed to anticipate the kinds of pie-in-the-sky objections that might be raised, cautioning that, quote, irrational prejudices against spending, deficits, and easy money, quote, must be ignored. 1965. But he recognized that legitimate barriers must be taken into account. Quote, economic forces can frustrate programs if either the policy objective is inconsistent with such forces or if the program is so poorly conceived that it quite unnecessarily runs afoul of a barrier, even though the objective is, in principle, attainable. End quote. Minsky. One such frustrating force is inflation. The policy problem, he argued, is to achieve and sustain tight, full employment without an inflationary rise in prices and wages. Minsky, 1972. But Minsky's anti-poverty campaign called for, quote, a rapid increase of those wages that are close to or below the poverty line, end quote, 1965. He recognized that there might be an inflationary bias in a policy of this sort, particularly if the productivity output per hour of the low-wage workers failed to keep pace with their wage increases. In order to keep the overall price level fairly stable, prices of other goods and services would have to be constrained. Minsky suggested that in the high-wage industries, wages, quote, would have to rise by less than the increases in the productivity of their workers. 1965. To prevent firms from simply increasing their profits, it was necessary to ensure that, quote, management in these often oligopolistic industries would have to pass this decline in unit costs onto their customers, end quote. Thus, he argued that, quote, effective profit and price constraints would have to accompany tight, full employment, end quote, 1972. Footnote 9. He also proposed the elimination of taxes on corporate income and corporate contributions to Social Security, both of which he considered inflationary. Hawley, 1981. End footnote. If inflationary pressures were not contained, Minsky feared that the, quote, political popularity of full employment would be undermined, end quote. The inflation constraint is, however, much less of a concern in today's global economy. First, the deflationary pressures around the globe are substantial as many nations keep domestic demand depressed in order to run trade surpluses, looking to the United States to provide demand for the world's excess output. This means that U.S. firms face substantial price competition so that even relatively rapid growth, such as that experienced in the Clinton expansion, does not produce inflationary pressures. Second, removal of trade restrictions together with technological advances has increased wage competition from abroad, reducing the likelihood that low unemployment could generate a wage price spiral. Finally, much of the 1970s and 1980s concern with low productivity growth disappeared during the Clinton boom, when productivity growth returned to more normal long-range averages. Pigeon and Wray, 2002. Even in recent months, the fear has been that productivity growth might be so high that it would hinder job growth. While we believe that there is a lot of misunderstanding about the nature and importance of productivity growth, to the extent that competitive pressures keep wage growth in line with productivity growth, price pressures will remain moderate. The final institutional barrier we wish to take up concerns the exchange rate regime. Most of Minsky's papers on anti-poverty policy were written in the 1960s or early 1970s, when U.S. policy was constrained by an international monetary system with fixed exchange rates. Because the integrity of the Bretton Woods system rested on dollar convertibility to gold, policymakers had to restrict their fiscal and monetary operations to those that would not adversely affect the balance of payments. In Minsky's words, quote, "To a considerable extent, ever since 1958, the needs of the dollar standard have acted as a constraint upon domestic income. We have not had tight labor markets because of the peculiar bind that the dollar is in internationally." It is apparently appropriate to allude to William Jennings Bryan by saying that, in part, the cross that the American poor bear is made of gold. The solution to the gold standard barrier is simple. Get rid of the gold standard. End quote. 1965. Today, the dollar is a floating currency, so that policy is not constrained by the need to protect foreign reserves. Thus, the primary barrier to attaining and sustaining tight full employment is political will. Footnote 10. Designing policies to achieve full employment and price stability are the focus of a recent book by Wray, 1998. The book demonstrates how Minsky's employer of last resort program could be implemented by nations with floating currencies in a non-inflationary way. End footnote.